Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got, well, quite a mountain of sources in front of us today. It's everything from Greek political theory, Roman law basics, all the way up to some really dense imperial administration stuff.
It really is a roadmap, isn't it? But
Yeah.
maybe not in the usual sense. We're not just tracing history here. Think of it more like a legal archaeology dig.
Legal archaeology, I like that.
Yeah, we're digging into what's called the social DNA of Greece and Rome, trying to see how the actual written laws work to, well, create and enforce some pretty stark social hierarchies.
Exactly. So our mission for you, listener, is to unpack these specific legal tools for social control. We want to figure out, what was the state really trying to protect? Who was left completely vulnerable?
And maybe find some of those surprising loopholes or contradictions that existed even in these really rigid systems.
Yeah, those aha moments where you see what the law really cared about, whether that was protecting citizens or maybe just making sure the grain supply was safe or that business kept running. So let's get into it.
Okay, first stop, Athens. We always think democracy, right? But they had this really powerful, maybe even a bit blunt legal tool specifically designed to kick powerful people out. Ostracism.
Ostracism, yeah. It's like political spring cleaning. Traditionally, it's linked to Cleisthenes. And it was a big shift, really.
How so?
Well, it took the job of preventing tyranny away from the old aristocratic council, the Areopagus, and put it squarely in the hands of the ordinary voting citizens, the demos.
And the actual process, it wasn't just a whim, was it? It sounds quite formal.
Meticulous, almost ceremonial. So in the sixth Prytany, that's like a tenth of the year, the assembly first voted if they should even hold an ostracism.
Okay, so a vote just to decide whether to vote later?
Exactly. If they voted yes, then two Prytanies later, in the eighth one, they'd hold the actual ostracism vote.
And where did this happen? Right out in the open, in the agora, the marketplace. Super public. Citizens would scratch the name of the person they wanted, banished onto a piece of pottery, an ostracon, and drop it in an urn. A very visible public ritual.
Right, the ostraca. And there was a crucial numbers game involved, too, wasn't there?
Absolutely critical. To even make the vote count, you needed a minimum of 6,000 votes cast in total. A quorum.
6,000? That's a lot of people showing up.
It shows the seriousness. If they hit that number, then the person whose name showed up the most, even if it was just by one vote, well, they were out.
Out, but not completely crushed. That seems important.
That's the key difference, yeah. Condemned, but not destroyed. They had 10 days to get out of Attica, and they had to stay away for 10 years.
But crucially,
They kept their property and their citizenship rights. This wasn't about punishing a crime. It was like political surgery, removing someone seen as a potential threat to the democracy itself, just temporarily.
It's fascinating that Cleisthenes apparently had a specific target in mind originally.
The story goes he wanted to banish Hipparchus, who was related to the old tyrants, the Pisistratids. And, well, it worked. Hipparchus was the first recorded person to actually be ostracized. A preemptive strike, basically, using the law.
So that's how Athens dealt with potentially problematic elites. But then there's this amazing counterpoint looking at daily life for, well, everyone else. From a source that's, let's say, not a fan of democracy.
Right, a very cynical oligarchical viewpoint. But it gives this startling picture of the reality for non-elites on the ground.
And this is where things get really surprising, legally speaking. This writer argues that the poor, the common folk, actually deserved more power. Not out of fairness, but
because they were the engine of the state. His argument was, they row the ships and make the city powerful. Not the fancy, well-born hoplite soldiers. It was the rowers, the masses. Functional power.
And that functional power somehow translated into this weird level of freedom for slaves and medics, the resident foreigners.
Yeah, the writer is clearly annoyed by it. He calls it unreasonable freedom and immunity. Unreasonable.
I mean, the quote is just stunning. Why, you may not strike one of them, nor will a slave make way for you in the street. Think about that. A slave doesn't have to step aside for a citizen, and you can't just hit them.
It seems completely backward for what we assume about ancient hierarchies, right? Like some kind of advanced human rights protection.
But that wasn't it, was it? The reason was much more mundane.
According to our grumpy oligarch, absolutely not about ethics. It was, believe it or not, about fashion, or lack thereof.
Okay, explain. The fashion crime that led to legal protection.
He says the ordinary poor citizens dressed so badly you just couldn't tell them apart from a slave or a medic on the street.
So the risk for an elite guy was?
Simple. You lash out at someone who looks like a slave, maybe bumps into you, but oops, turns out he's a citizen, just poorly dressed. Now you're in real trouble. Assaulting a fellow citizen. There'd be, as the source says, a to-do.
So to avoid accidentally hitting a citizen, they basically had to avoid hitting anyone who looked poor.
Exactly. Universal restraint forced by bad fashion and the inability to distinguish status visually. Those slaves' immunity was just like collateral benefit.
Wow, that is quite the nugget. Legal protection flowing not from morals, but from the practical difficulty of telling people apart. Amazing.
It really shows how law sometimes develops for reasons that have nothing to do with high-minded ideals, just avoiding administrative hassle and public brawls.
Okay, so Athens is managing elites with ostracism and accidentally protecting the lower orders through, well, bad tailoring. Let's switch gears hard now to early Rome and the 12 tables. If Athens seems complex, early Rome seems brutal, especially about property.
Brutal's a good word. It's a stark contrast. Early Roman law, as shown in the call tables, seems laser-focused on protecting agricultural property. The severity of the punishments tells you everything about their priorities.
And the classic example is stealing corn, right? Not exactly armed robbery.
No, just sneaking onto someone's land at night, maybe letting your animals graze or cutting some standing grain secretly at
Good.
night.
The penalty.
Capital crime. Capital erat. Full stop.
And the method. It wasn't just execution, was it? There was something else going on.
Oh yeah, the language is chilling. The thief was to be hanged and killed, suspensum quae cerere nicari aebabant, hanged and killed for Ceres, the goddess of grain, dedicated to her.
Dedicated. Wow. But it's the comparison they make that's really mind-blowing.
Right. The text explicitly states this punishment was considered gravius quam in homicidio convictum, more serious than being convicted of homicide.
More serious than murder. For stealing corn, we have to unpack that. Why?
You have to think about what early Rome was. It was an agrarian state. Its entire survival depended on the harvest, on the fields being secure. An attack on the crops, especially a sneaky one at night.
It wasn't just theft.
It was seen as almost treasonous, an attack on the community's lifeline, and an offense against the gods, against Ceres who protected the grain. So the punishment had to be extreme, public, and sacralized, a ritual to restore order, both earthly and divine.
Whereas murder, while obviously a crime,
Lacked that specific existential threat to the state's foundation, and that direct offense against the agricultural deity. It shows law being used to hammer home an ideology. Farming is sacred. Messing with it is worse than killing a person.
that intense focus on property, especially agricultural property, carries over into other crimes too, like arson.
Definitely. The law about burning down a house, or even just a stack of grain near a house, was similarly harsh. But there's an interesting detail there.
Which is?
The law specifies it had to be done science-prudent-esque, knowingly and intentionally.
Ah. So intent matters, even in this really early harsh code.
Yes, that's crucial. They're already making a distinction. If you accidentally set a fire, the penalty would likely be different, maybe paying damages. But if you deliberately set fire to someone's house or grain store...
Then the punishment fits the crime, quite literally.
Exactly. Vinctus verberatus igni necari ibitur. Bound, beaten, and killed by fire. Symmetrical, terrifying justice. It shows that even amid the brutality, they're building concepts like criminal intent, mens rea.
So the 12 tables really set this foundation, didn't they? Codified severity, especially for anything threatening the home or the food supply. Using public, often ritualized violence as a deterrent. Very different vibe from Athens.
Absolutely. Now, fast forward a bit in Roman history and legal thinking, and we hit maybe the biggest paradox in their whole system. The slave.
Right. The person who is legally a thing, property, res.
Legally, yes, chattel, like a tool or an animal. But, and this is the huge, but also capable of acting in ways that created major legal and financial consequences for their masters.
That tension existed elsewhere too, right? You mentioned Plato.
Yeah, Plato pointed out how controversial the Spartan Helots were, basically state-owned serfs, treated horrifically. Yet even he noted that on a personal level, many masters found their slaves incredibly reliable, even better in every way than brethren or sons, trusting them with their lives and property.
So this ethical messiness, Rome basically just codified it, didn't resolve it.
Pretty much. Roman law didn't try to solve the moral problem. It created complex rules to manage the practicalities. How do you deal legally with someone who is property but also runs your shop?
So if a slave couldn't legally be a person, how did their actions have legal weight, like with contracts?
Okay, so the slave couldn't bind himself in a contract. He had no legal standing, no will of his own in the eyes of the law. But he could acquire rights or property for his master.
Ah, so he's like an extension of the master, a legal tool.
Exactly, an agent. The law cared more about making commerce work than about the slave's personhood. If a slave made a deal for the master, the law needed ways to make that deal stick for the master's benefit.
Let's look at a really serious area where this played out. Inheritance. What if someone left property to a slave in their will?
Okay, this gets super technical, which tells you how much they thought about it. If the slave was named an heir, and then the master freed him or sold him before the inheritance was settled.
Could he still inherit?
Often, yes. Especially if the inheritance involved, say, property belonging to a town or municipality. The legal power of the will could sometimes survive the change in the slave's status.
But there were limits, hard limits based on the slave's legal standing or lack thereof.
Big limits. If that same slave was condemned as a servus puni, basically sentenced to the worst punishments like death, fighting beasts, or forced labor in the mines,
Then the inheritance was?
gone. The law treated it as if the clause naming him heir had not been made. It was a legal fiction. The state's power to degrade the slave to this subhuman level completely wiped out the private will of the person who died. State punishment trumped private inheritance.
That says a lot about the state's ultimate power. Okay, what about slaves in business? You hear about slaves managing shops, ships.
Right, and this is where you see that quiet, practical power slaves could wield. If a master set up a slave as or a manager, say, running his olive oil shop down in Arles,
And gave him permission to borrow money for the business.
then the master was fully on the hook, legally liable for everything that slave did in running that business. The law had to protect the people lending money or selling goods to the slave manager. It protected the market.
So the law isn't protecting the slave, it's protecting the system, ensuring third parties could trust deals made by these slave agents.
Precisely. It forced the master to stand behind the economic role he'd given the slave. Didn't matter if the slave was co-owned or was captaining a ship under maritime law. The rules were built so business could function, using slaves as proxies. Pure pragmatism.
It gets even wilder when you look at how slaves could gain freedom, especially the statute liberi, those promised freedom in a will, but only if they met some condition.
Yes. The rules here seem almost designed to help the slave get free, to stop the heir from blocking it.
Like the example of paying money to an absent heir.
Classic case. Freedom depends on giving, say, 100 denarii to the heir, but the heir conveniently disappears or is out of the province. Is the slave stuck?
You'd think so, but no.
No. The law provided a workaround. The slave could take the money, put it under seal, proving it's the right amount, and untouched, and deposit it in a public temple.
Like escrow almost.
Kind of. By doing that, the slave showed good faith. The money was there, waiting.
Yeah.
The slave could then claim freedom immediately upon the heir's eventual return. The law wouldn't let simple absence derail the promised manumission.
That's really clever legal engineering. What if the condition was service, like serve my heir for a year?
Similar pro-freedom logic. If the condition was continuous service for, say, a year, but the slave got sick for a month.
Did the clock reset?
No. As long as the slave wanted to serve, was willing but unable due to illness, that time still counted towards the year. The law looked at intent, the desire to fulfill the condition.
Okay, this leads to maybe the most complex bit. Theft committed by a slave right in that weird limbo period before freedom.
Ah, yes. The slave is named to be free in the will. The master dies. But the heir hasn't formally accepted the inheritance yet. There's this gap.
And the slave thinks,
I can steal from the estate now. I'm about to be free, so they can't punish me as a slave, but I'm not yet a free man, so they can't prosecute me as one for stealing from what was technically my master's stuff. A perceived legal loophole.
And the law's response.
The law hated this. Based on natural equity, it created a special action against him for double damages. It wouldn't allow this kind of status manipulation to shield theft. No way.
So Roman law seems incredibly flexible, almost contradictory with slaves, using whatever definition, property, agent, near freeman, best served order, commerce, or preventing chaos. Status wasn't fixed, it was functional.
And if the slave status was this complex shifting thing, the status of a Roman citizen, especially out in the provinces, was defined by one thing above all: protection. A legal shield against arbitrary power.
The Apostle Paul case being the textbook example, right?
Yep.
Stuck in Judea, facing hostile local authorities.
And he plays the trump card. I appeal to Caesar. Save the throw minus some. I am a Roman citizen. That invocation, the provocatio, it wasn't a request.
It was a demand. It stopped the provincial governor in his tracks.
Absolutely. The governor, procurator, legate, whatever his title, simply could not execute a Roman citizen. The key legal term was condemnaverit. He couldn't condemn him to death. The appeal had to be respected.
And the account mentions the governor, Festus, consulting his advisors, his concilium. Why the meeting if the rule was absolute?
Probably because actually having a citizen make that appeal in a place like Judea was incredibly rare. Festus likely needed his legal team to confirm the procedure, the paperwork, how to handle transferring this politically sensitive case all the way to Rome. It shows the sheer weight of citizenship. It forced the entire imperial administration to pause and reroute.
That's serious protection. The citizen's body, their life, was legally distinct, sacred almost, compared to a provincial subject.
And Rome didn't just protect citizens' lives, it made sure everyone saw the hierarchy. Status needed to be visible.
Which brings us to theater seating.
Sounds trivial, but it wasn't. The Lex Ratia Theatralis from 67 BCE explicitly reserved the front 14 rows in the theater for the top tiers. Senators and equitri, the equestrian class.
So every time you went to the theater, you got a visual reminder of the pecking order.
Exactly. Public spaces reinforced the hierarchy. It wasn't just theoretical, it was right there in front of you. Who sits where tells you who's who.
These status rules even extended into the personal lives of officials running the provinces, didn't they? Like who they could marry?
Oh yes. Very specific rules, laid out by jurists like Paulus. An official governing a province was flat out banned from marrying a local woman, someone born there or living there.
Why? To prevent conflicts of interest.
Precisely. Stop him getting too cozy with local elites, acquiring land or influence through marriage that might make him less loyal to Rome, more loyal to his new provincial family. Keep the administration impartial, at least in theory.
But there was a loophole, wasn't there? Betrothal was okay.
Yes, he could get engaged to her, but, and it's clever, but, the engagement contract had to specify that if she later decided not to marry him after he finished his term and left the province, she had to return the engagement gifts, the heire.
So it allowed romance, but kept the final commitment outside the period of his official power. Clever.
Very. But notice the flip side. The law did not stop that same official from marrying off his own daughters to men in that province.
Ah, so he can't be influenced by a local wife, but he can use his daughters to build alliances for his own family.
Exactly. It preserves his patriarchal authority to manage his family's future while trying to shield his office from undue local influence. The focus is always on maintaining the integrity and authority of the Roman administrator as an administrator.
Okay, so we have all these laws. Protecting citizens, marking status, controlling officials' marriages. Seems like a tightly controlled system. But reality, especially in the later empire, could be very different.
Tragically different. All the written rules could just evaporate when faced with corruption and the breakdown of authority. The case of Sylvanus from the mid-4th century is just brutal.
Sylvanus, a top general in Gaul, right, falls under suspicion of treason. The emperor sends someone to recall him.
Sends an agent in rebus, basically an imperial intelligence agent or courier, named Epidemius. This guy should be the embodiment of discipline, following orders.
But instead
of just delivering the recall letter, Epidemius immediately starts rounding up Sylvanus' staff, his servants, seizing their property, acting, as a historian Ammianus says, as if that man were already proscribed.
So mere suspicion was enough for an imperial agent to start looting, preemptively.
Yes. It shows a total collapse of due process. The system itself turning predatory the moment someone high up seemed vulnerable. Forget investigation, forget trial, just grab the goods.
And this internal rot had external consequences.
Huge ones. Ammianus explicitly links this kind of behavior. Imperial agents focused on plunder instead of administration to the disaster unfolding in Gaul at the time. He says all Gaul was at the time pillaged by barbarians. Without help coming from anyone.
Wow. So when the internal legal order breaks down, when the enforcers become bandits, the whole frontier defense just crumbles.
They're directly connected. You can't maintain borders if your own administration is rotten and focused on exploiting suspicion for profit. The legal framework only works if the people upholding it actually follow the rules.
What a sweep. From Athens using ostracism to manage its own elite, while accidentally giving street immunity to slaves because citizens dressed badly.
To early Rome making corn theft worse than murder, really hammering home the sacredness of agriculture through sheer terror in the 12 tables.
Then the incredible complexity of Roman slave law, the slave as both thing and vital economic agent, with all those technical rules about inheritance and freedom.
And finally, the majestic shield of Roman citizenship, the provocatio, standing alongside visible status markers like theater seats and rules, trying, sometimes failing, to keep provincial governors clean, until it all starts fraying with corruption like the Sylvanus case.
It really hammers home that power in the ancient world wasn't just about armies. It was meticulously written down, codified, the precision of the law defining who was safe, who was property, who could contract, who could appeal. That was a measure of state control.
Absolutely. The true strength wasn't just conquest, but the ability to draw those incredibly fine, often paradoxical legal lines between freedom and servitude, citizen and foreigner, protected and exploitable.
So here's something to chew on, listener, based on everything we've discussed. We saw the Roman state fiercely protect a citizen's life with the ultimate legal block, the provocatio. We saw early Rome devise a death for a corn thief more terrifying than for a murderer.
But then we saw later Roman law become incredibly pragmatic, also obsessed with the details of a slave's ability to manage businesses, borrow money, affect inheritances, focusing on liability and commercial function.
So the final question for you, where did the real underlying power and priority of the Roman state ultimately reside? Was it in the dramatic, symbolic, often brutal enforcement of status and order seen in executions and appeals? Or was it in the quieter, more complex, relentlessly pragmatic legal framework that kept the economy humming, even if it meant giving legal agency to those considered property? What truly drove the machine?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.